scared. Anthony Horowitz. Gary Wilson was lost. He was also hot, tired, and angry. As he slogged his way through a field that looked exactly the same as the last field and exactly the same as the one ahead, he cursed the countryside, his grandmother for living it, and above all his mother for dragging him from their comfortable London house and dumping him in the middle of it. When he got home, he would make her suffer, that was for sure. But where exactly was home? How had he managed to get so lost? He stopped for the 10th time and tried to get his bearing. If there had been a hill, he would have climbed it, trying to catch sight of the pink cottage where his grandmother lived. But this was Suffolk, the flattest country in England, where country lanes could lie perfectly concealed behind even the shortest length of grass, and where the horizon was always much further away than it had any right to be. Gary was 15 years old, tall for his age, with a permanent scowl and narrow eyes of the fully qualified school bully. He wasn't heavily built. If anything, he was on the thin side, but he had long arms, hard fists, and he knew how to use them. Maybe that was what made him so angry now. Gary liked to be in control. He knew how to look after himself. If anyone had seen him stumbling along an empty field in the middle of nowhere, they'd have laughed at him, and of course he'd have had to pay them back. Nobody laughed at Gary Wilson. Not at his name, not at his place in class, always last, not at the acne which had recently exploded across his face. Generally, people avoided him, which suited Gary fine. He actually enjoyed hurting other kids, taking their lunch money or ripping pages out of their books. But scaring them was just as much fun. He liked what he saw in their eyes. They were scared, and Gary liked that best of all. About a quarter of the way across the field, Gary's foot found a pothole in the ground, and he was sent sprawling with his hands outstretched. He managed to save himself from falling, but a bolt of pain shot up his leg as his ankle twisted. He swore silently, the four-letter word that always made his mother twitch nervously in her chair. She had long since stopped trying to talk him out of using bad language. He was as tall as her now, and he knew that in her own quiet way she was scared of him too. Sometimes she would try to reason with him, but for her the time of telling had long since passed. He was her only child. Her husband, Edward Wilson, had been a clerk at the local bank until one day, quite suddenly, he had fallen over dead. It was a massive heart attack, they said. He was still holding his date stamp in one hand when they found him. Gary had never got on with his father and hadn't really missed him, particularly when he realized that he was now the man of the house. The house in question was a 2-up, 2-down, part of a terrace in Notting Hill Gate. There were insurance policies and the bank provided a small pension so that Jane Wilson was able to keep it. Even so, she'd had to go back to work to support Gary and herself. No need to ask which of the two was the more expensive. Holidays abroad were out of the question. As much as Gary whined and complained, Jane Wilson couldn't find the money. But her mother lived on a farm in Suffolk, and twice a year, in the summer and at Christmas, the two of them made the 2-hour train journey up from London to Pye Hall, just outside the little village of Earlsham. It was a glorious place. A single track ran up from the road, past a line of poplar trees and a Victorian farmhouse, and on through a gap in the hedge. The track seemed to come to an end here, but in fact it twisted and continued on to a tiny lopsided cottage painted a soft Suffolk pink in a sea of daisy-strewn grass. "Isn't it beautiful?" his mother had said as the taxi from the station had rattled up the lane. A couple of black crows swooped overhead and landed in a nearby field. Gary had sniffed. "Pye Hall," his mother had sighed. "I was so happy here once." But where was it? Where was Pye Hall? As he crossed what he now realized was a quite enormous field, Gary found himself wincing with every step. He was also beginning to feel the first stirrings of something. He wasn't actually scared. He was too angry for that. But he was beginning to wonder just how much further he would have to walk before he knew where he was, and how much further could he walk. He swatted at a fly that was buzzing him and went on. Gary had allowed his mother to talk him into coming, knowing that if he complained hard enough, she would be forced to bribe him with a handful of CDs at the very least. Sure enough, he had passed the journey from Liverpool Street to Ipswich listening to heavy metal hits and had been in a good enough mood to give his grandmother a quick peck on the cheek when they arrived. "You've grown so much," the old lady had exclaimed as he slouched into a battered armchair beside the open fireplace in the front room. She always said that. She was so boring. She glanced at her daughter. "You're looking thinner, Jane, and you're tired. You've got no colour at all." "Mother, I'm fine." "No, you're not. You don't look well. But a week in the country will soon sort you out. A week in the country." As he climbed onward and onward through the field, swatting again at the wretched fly that was still circling his head, Gary thought longingly of concrete roads, bus stops, traffic lights, and hamburgers. At last he reached the hedge that divided this field from the next, and he grabbed at it, tearing at the leaves with his bare hands. Too late, he saw the nettles behind the leaves. Gary yowled, bringing his clenched hand to his lips. A string of white bumps rose up, scattered across the palm and insides of his fingers. What was so great about the country? Oh, his grandmother went on about the peace, the fresh air, all the usual rubbish spouted by people who wouldn't even recognize a zebra crossing if they saw one. People with no life at all. The flowers and the trees and the birds and the bees, yeah. "Everything is different in the country," she would say. "You float along with time. You don't feel time rushing past you. You can stand out here and imagine how things were before people spoiled everything with their noise and their machines. You can still feel the magic in the countryside, the power of Mother Nature. It's all around you, alive, waiting." Gary had listened to the old woman and sneered. She was obviously getting senile. There was no magic in the countryside, only days that seemed to drag on forever and nights with nothing to do. Mother Nature, that was a good one. Even if the old girl had existed, which was unlikely, she had long ago been finished off by the cities, buried under miles of concrete motorway, driving along the M25 at 100 miles per hour with the roof open and the CD player on full volume. To Gary, that would be real magic. After a few days lazing around the house, Gary had allowed his grandmother to persuade him to go for a walk. The truth was that he was bored by the two women, and anyway, out in the fields he would be able to smoke a couple of the cigarettes he had bought with money stolen from his mother's handbag. "Make sure you follow the footpaths, Gary," his mother had said. "And don't forget the country code," his grandmother had added. Gary remembered the country code all right. As he ambled away from Pye Hall, he picked wild flowers and tore them to shreds. When he came to a gate, he deliberately left it open, smiling to himself as he thought of the farm animals that might now wander onto the road. He drank a Coke and span the crumpled can into the middle of a meadow full of buttercups. He half snapped the branch off an apple tree and left it dangling there. He smoked a cigarette and threw the butt, still glowing, into the long grass. And he had strayed off the footpath. Perhaps that hadn't been such a good idea. He was lost before he knew it. He was tramping through a field, crushing the crop underfoot, when he realized that the ground was getting soft and mushy. His foot broke through the corn or whatever it was, and water curled over his shoe, soaking into his sock. Gary grimaced, thought for a moment, and decided to go back the way he had come. Only the way he had come was somehow no longer there. It should have been. He had left enough landmarks after all, but suddenly the broken branch, Coke tin, and the torn-up plants had vanished, nor was there any sign of the footpath. In fact, there was nothing at all that Gary recognized. It was very odd. That had been over 2 hours ago. Since then, things had gone from bad to worse. Gary had made his way through a small wood, although he was sure there hadn't been a wood anywhere near Pye Hall, and had managed to scratch his shoulder and gash his leg on a briar. A moment later he had backed into a tree which had torn his favourite jacket, a black and white striped blazer that he had shoplifted from an Oxfam shop in Notting Hill Gate. He had managed to get out of the wood, but even that hadn't been easy. Suddenly he found a stream blocking his path, and the only way to cross it had been to balance on a log that was lying in the middle. He had almost done it too, but at the last minute the log had rolled under his foot, hurling him backwards into the water. He had stood up, spluttering and swearing. 10 minutes later he had stopped to have another cigarette, but the whole packet was sodden, useless. And now he screamed as the insect, which he had assumed was a fly, but which in fact was a wasp, stung him on the side of the neck. He pulled at his damp and dirty Bart Simpson t-shirt, squinting down to see the damage. Out of the corner of his eye he could just make out the edge of a huge red swelling. He shifted his weight onto his bad foot and groaned as fresh pain shuddered upwards. Where was Pie Hall? This was all his mother's fault and his grandmother's. They were the ones who'd suggested the walk. Well, they'd pay for it. Perhaps they'd think twice about how lovely the countryside was when they saw their precious cottage go up in smoke. And then he saw it. The pink walls and slanting chimneys were unmistakable. Somehow he had found his way back. He only had one more field to cross and he'd be there. With a stifled sob, Gary set off. There was a path of sorts going around the side of the field, but he wasn't having any of that. He walked straight across the middle. It had only just been sown. Too bad. This field was even bigger than the one he had just crossed, and the sun seemed to be hotter than ever. The soil was soft, and his feet sank into it. His ankle was on fire, and every step he took, his legs seemed to get heavier and heavier. The wasp wouldn't leave him alone either. It was buzzing round his head, round and round, the noise drilling into his skull. But Gary was too tired to swat at it again. His arms hung lifelessly in their sockets, his fingertips brushing against the legs of his jeans. The smell of the countryside filled his nostrils, rich and deep, making him feel sick. He had walked now for 10 minutes, maybe longer, but Pie Hall was no closer. It was blurred, shimmering on the edge of his vision. He wondered if he was suffering from sunstroke. Surely it hadn't been as hot as this when he set out. Every step was becoming more difficult. It was as if his feet were trying to root themselves to the ground. He looked back, whimpering as his collar rubbed the wasp's sting, and saw with relief that he was exactly halfway across the field. Something ran down his cheek and dripped off his chin, but whether it was sweat or a tear, he couldn't say. He couldn't go any further. There was a pole stuck in the ground ahead of him, and Gary seized hold of it gratefully. He would have to rest for a while. The ground was too soft and damp to sit on, so he would rest standing up, holding on to the pole. Just a few minutes, then he would cross the rest of the field, and then, when the sun began to set and there was still no sign of Gary, his grandmother called the police. The officer in charge took a description of the lost boy, and that same night they began a cross-country search that would go on for the next 5 days. But there was no trace of him. The police thought he might have got into a car with a stranger. He might have been abducted, but nobody had seen anything. It was as if the countryside had taken him and swallowed him up, one policeman said. Gary watched as the police finally left. He watched as his mother carried her suitcase out of Pie Hall and got into the taxi that would take her back to Ipswich station and her train to London. He was glad to see that she had the decency to cry, mourning her loss, but he couldn't help feeling that she looked rather less tired and rather less ill than she had when she arrived. Gary's mother didn't see him. As she turned round in the taxi to wave goodbye to her mother and Pie Hall, she did notice that this time there were no crows. But then she saw why. They had been scared away by a figure that was standing in the middle of a field, leaning on a stick. For a moment she thought she recognized its torn black and white jacket and the grimy Bart Simpson t-shirt, but she was probably confused. It was best not to say anything. The taxi accelerated past the new scarecrow and continued down past the poplar trees to the main road.